Okay, so this is the Medieval World lecture, and I apologize, the sound quality may be a little up and down. I'm going to try and avoid that. Uh, as you're watching, you can take notes, but also make a list of any questions in regards to these notes. So, just as a reminder, today's notes, the whole mind map activity, all relates to question 8. Explain the causes and effects of Europe's political decentralization and social organization. So, just as a kind of an overview, the Middle Ages in Europe is usually divided into three different periods for a structure. The early Middle Ages from 500 to 1000 CE, period of a lot of invasion, formation of states. By 1000 CE, all of the Germanic invasions, all of the Viking invasions, etc., they've all been converted to Christianity, and that's why we mark a shift into the High Middle Ages when things are more stable. Trade begins to pick up. We see some intellectual process. And then 1300 we mark as the shift into late Middle Ages, which is when things begin to collapse. They experience the Black Death. They have issues with the church authority, a whole nine yards. And 1450 or 1400 is usually marked as the end, quote unquote, of the Middle Ages. So, why do you end up, right? Why do you end up with a feudal structure? Um, to begin with, the world falls apart in Western Europe when Rome falls in 476. Once that happens, there's no centralized government. Um, you don't have an imperial army anymore. You don't have a government that is taking care of various pieces. At the same time, you have invasions, first of Germanic peoples, but the biggest invasions come from the Vikings, the Magyars, even the Muslims begin as they expand to invade into Western Europe. And as a result, people's priorities shift from uh, what we think of as sort of everyday life to basically how are we going to survive, right? Trade has entirely collapsed. So, what are we going to eat, right? And how are we going to defend ourselves, right? And the result, without a centralized government, is that people look to those who have power to provide the answers to that question. So if you read the article on feudalism, this will look, a little familiar to you. And essentially, feudalism, right, is this structure of a decentralized monarchy, right, king at the top, who allows lords and knights certain authority in order to receive military aid from them, right? The biggest support for that system is the peasants, the serfs, who are in this manorial system. The food, right? And the knights and the lords provide the protection for them and the military service for the king for whatever he needs to do. The reason we call it the manorial system, right, is that everything is based around this idea of a manor. Every knight, every lord has an estate, sometimes known as a manor. And it was really very important because there was limited to no trade, depending on where you were, to be self sufficient, right? So the serfs were responsible for farming the land, for producing the food. Some of it would be for themselves. Some of it is going to the Lord, and some of it would go to the local parson, right? Serfs are not slaves, but they have little freedom. They cannot leave the manor, right? A knight cannot say, all right, I'm going to send you to a different manor, right? Even if it's a manor that he owns, he can't send them, right? They essentially belong to the land. And that comes back to the self sufficiency piece, which is if a serf leaves, you're impacting the ability of the manor to be self sufficient. So it's actually illegal for serfs to leave the manor. And most, given the nature of life during this time, from 500 to 1450, the bulk of the population would not actually travel any further than maybe 30 miles away in their lifetime. Right? Social hierarchy, you would have seen this: those who prayed, right? Those who fought, those who worked. And that's how they like to organize society. You belong to one of those groups. As in the High Middle Ages, merchants develop and lawyers develop and artisans develop, it becomes harder to maintain these three orders. Um, but it doesn't collapse until later. So you have a group, all right? Some of you have read about the Christian practices for the peasants, right? Which is very, very interesting. And that is really how the bulk of the population is working. But it's important to understand that the Catholic Church is the head, right? Is the structure that is the only unified structure throughout Western Europe. And it took its structure from the Roman Empire. So you have the Pope, right? Just like you had in the past a Roman emperor. He lives in Rome, right? His goals are to maintain the power of the church, right? To oversee the entire flock of what they called Christendom, and to have the kings, right, all sort of see him as above them. And that's sort of the biggest um, budding area in between religion and the state, which is the kings really don't see the Pope as having direct authority over their kingdom, right, or over them. And so there's a lot of fighting between the Pope and the kings, which becomes more pronounced in the late Middle Ages over how much authority the Pope has about decisions that they make in their kingdom. The next level in the church are the next major level. There are cardinals, but we're going to go to the archbishops. And the archbishops are assigned to individual kingdoms. Usually there are a few, but it depends on the size of the kingdom and the state. Their job is really to oversee the Catholic Church in their region, in their state, and also to essentially act as diplomats and interact with the kings. Right? They get the church's goals from the popes, from the pope. There would only be one at a time, um, and they carry that out with the king. Those of you who read about the Christianity among the peasants, right? You have a parish priest in the village, right, who is providing services to those villagers. And you would note, right, and I hope you'll bring this up as you're working on your mind map, the parish priest couldn't necessarily read or write. And everything they knew, they'd learned by rote because they actually come out of that peasant role. They might be, if a parish priest sees a particularly bright peasant boy, he might, right, act and have that boy go to the church. That would be the one exception to staying within, right? But their role and duty is around the village. So the aristocracy, for men, the goal is military training. They trained from childhood to become knights, and that was really their focus was to be on the battlefield. Right, the whole system depends on them being able to provide defense. Women, on the other hand, their focus was for marriage. Right now, interestingly enough, because it is a time of warfare, particularly in the early and middle and the late Middle Ages, um, a woman, an aristocratic woman, could also be expected to know to how to um, organize the defense of the castle. Right. So, how do I? She's if her husband is away at war, she is responsible for basically saying, "Here's what we need to do if they're attacked." So there is kind of an interesting element for aristocratic women that even though basically they're supposed to be um, uh, giving birth to children and following that traditional female role, they did have some authority if their husbands were absent. For the aristocracy, chivalry was the guide for behavior, right? The code of what they needed to do, how they treated one another. It permeates everything. It permeates their culture. It permeates some of the interactions between aristocratic men and women, their stories. Um, However, they don't actually follow it. So even though it lays out like how you should treat one another in terms of battlefield and what honor is, it all goes out the window whenever they need to do something that they consider to be more important than chivalry. Um, Entertainment um, for the aristocracy was not bad. Men, obviously, because they were training, they would hold tournaments in which they'd joust, or they'd go and they'd be, both men and women actually would hunt, particularly with falcons. Women, needlepoint and listening to troubadours. So there was time for enjoyment of life. The commoners, right, the bulk of which are serfs, who, as I mentioned before, are not slaves, are living a very different kind of life, right? They're not living as comfortably. Gender relationships are actually more close at the level of the peasants, close but not equal. Women are required to work in the fields or in the small gardens by the peasant houses. And so, as a result, men and women tended to have a more equal relationship. In addition, commoners would marry often in their late teens, um, early 20s. And so they would be of a similar age. Whereas in the aristocracy, to be honest, you'd have a man who would be in his 30s marrying a young woman who could be anywhere from 15 to 18. That wasn't uncommon. So commoners had relationships that would be much more similar to what we see today. There isn't really entertainment for commoners. They need to be working, right? Farming it takes place at multiple different tasks take place multiple points of the season. They don't really have weekends. They might have off for a holy day. They might have off to go attend mass, but those are moments as opposed to scheduled like vacations and breaks. And as a result, there's not a whole lot else to their life beyond the work and the provided religious celebrations. Um, the population is not literate, and they're not considered um, to be in need of finer things in life. All right, so now we get to some fun things. Diet. Meat in general was for aristocrats only, with a couple of exceptions. Obviously, this is before refrigeration, so there are issues of freshness. Meat was generally salted, but to preserve it, to have it last longer, but it wasn't unusual to eat it past what we would consider safe times. It's another reason why spices become so desired by the Europeans. Fish was an important part of the diet for Europeans at this time. There are times such as Lent when the church says you're not to eat meat during this time, but fish was allowed. Um, if you were on the coasts, if you were by rivers where fish were plentiful, you would tend to have a lot more fish in your diet. Even if you were a peasant, you would have more fish in your diet. And one of the few elements of trade that would go on was importing fish from the coast. For the peasants, grains and vegetables made up the bulk of their diet. Um, so they would have a coarse black bread. They would have different vegetables that would perhaps make up some kind of stew. um, they could have pork, which would be the one animal that they would have close contact with, that they might be allowed to, around a holy day, slaughter. um, I always find it interesting. I come from a German background. A number of my ancestors are German, and so it's very common in my family, and I believe this is a Pennsylvania Dutch as well as a German tradition to have pork and sauerkraut on the new year. And sauerkraut is one way of preparing cabbage, and cabbage would be a vegetable that they would have quite a lot of. So I always think on New Year's Day when I'm enjoying that meal that I'm harkening back to my medieval ancestors. Hygiene, the gross part of the lecture. So, baths were basically considered to be unsafe or unsanitary. You have to keep in mind there's no running water, so they also required a great deal of labor to create a heated bath. So, serfs typically did not bathe over the course of their lifetime. They might bathe for their wedding, right? But otherwise, the only time that they would sort of wash off would be men when swimming. They might do kind of like a sponge cleanup, but bathing the way we do today was unknown. The aristocracy typically would bathe yearly, or they might have an extra bath if they were visiting court, or if the king was coming to visit them if they're high aristocracy. Parasites are everywhere. I mean, just everywhere. Lice was a huge issue. In fact, aristocratic women were responsible for picking the lice out of the hair and beards of their close male relatives, husbands, brothers, fathers, whatever. A woman in the village could earn extra money to be a delouser for the castle and take the linen and wash it off in whatever stream, or getting water from a pond, and washing off the lice and getting rid of it. Floors, it would vary. Serfs are basically going to have like dirt floors with straw on top, and the castle would have stone floors with straw on top. And generally, those get cleaned out. Serfs less frequently. The castle, like twice a year, they'll sweep out the straw, and then lay down new ones. Bedding, in addition, for serfs, it might just be straw with linen wrapped over it, or lots of linen together. Cleaning was infrequent. I know that many medieval films show the shining moat around the castle, and then when the castle's invaded, people go swimming through it, or people swim in it. I always think of the Sword in the Stone cartoon movie where Arthur swims in the moat. But in fact, in the Middle Ages, the moat is the last place that you want to go because there is no sewage system. So serfs would have, what we would think of as like a latrine or outhouse. For the aristocrats, though, they would have chamber pots. This is what chamber pots were originally for. And the chamber pots would be emptied out the window into the moat below, or emptied out into the nearby stream or lake, or wherever was most convenient. They looked for water sources. Some of the earliest actual bathrooms in medieval Europe in castles were little stone rooms that jutted off the side of the castle. You had a seat with a hole that was actually a hole, and everything dropped into the moat below. So yeah, not very hygienic. As a result, I'm sure you're not surprised that their medical abilities were incredibly poor, right? Their understanding was limited. They had no knowledge of where disease comes from. I mean, in Dar al Islam, I have to apologize, that's the dog moving around. In Dar al Islam, they were already speculating that there were tiny organisms that cause disease, right? But not in Europe. In Europe, they basically thought it was either religious in cause, right? That you had done something wrong and God was punishing you, or the more common and more popular belief that began to emerge was the idea that your humors, these sort of four fluids in your body, were out of balance and needed to be sort of rebalanced. So medicine and medical care was either religious, by prayer, or it was incredibly primitive. So a common medical practice was that if a person was sick, they would bleed them, right? So leeches or actually cutting them. Um, there is no attempt to be hygienic or clean in terms of these practices. Medical care was a lot of hit and miss. So, the average person's life, for a peasant, it's 35 years. For an aristocrat, you might make it to 40 or 50. Infant mortality was incredibly high. Childbirth was perilous. If you were lucky, you would get a midwife who knew some of what she was doing, but you might end up with I mean, what we would think of as a quack, who would not know what they were doing. Um, so life was not great in Europe at this time. The Middle Ages comes to an end between 1300 and 1450 with a variety of changes. So, in warfare, they introduce a weapon called the longbow, which is essentially the machine gun of the Middle Ages. And if you're a king, do you want knights and lords who argue with you, or do you want a longbowman army, right? Whose longbow is so powerful it can punch straight through armor? The answer is that you want that longbow army. In addition, they were already moving towards more centralized governments. Kings are looking for ways to undercut the aristocrats and centralize power with them. And they have varying levels of success. Socially, the Black Death, which we'll look at more later, sweeps through Europe and kills one third to one half of the population. The Black Death was probably something that bubonic plague, but there's always argument. It was an incredibly devastating disease. It upset even the family unit at the peasant level. People basically were terrified. You got it, and the mortality rate was almost 100%. So once you had it, chances of death were almost assured. This also leads to a decline in the church because not only do people see parents abandoning children, right, but husbands abandoning wives, but they also see priests who flee out of fear, right? And so that leads people to sort of start to doubt the church. In addition, all of the church's remedies do very little, right, to nothing to actually stop the Black Death, right? That's one of the things that they believe you can do. Like religiously, you can pray and God will relieve you, and that doesn't. And so you see a lot of social disruption, social collapse, and that feeds into tearing down the blocks of feudalism. Lastly, economic changes come out. Trade does collapse during the Black Death because of everyone dying, being afraid, not wanting to, you're fleeing as opposed to trying to make an attempt to get goods from other places. Because so many people die, the need for labor actually increases. And so knights and aristocrats are actually willing to pay people to work on their estates. So you see the end of serfdom because a serf can work on another estate for a nice wage, or they can go into town once a town has kind of started to recover, and they can get a job where they'll get a salary. Like you just can't hold people because the demand for labor is so high. And as a result, essentially what you see is feudalism falling apart because without the manorial system, without the strength of the church reinforcing it, with a centralized government that has a standing army, feudalism doesn't make sense anymore. Make a note of what your questions are, and we will go over them on Monday. Go ahead and get started on your mind map. Remember, you'll need 5 additional terms on your mind map. So anything term-wise from these notes that you can add with your mind map would count.